I'm Karen Martell with OriginalGamer.com here at Playdum's offices with Raph Koster. He really doesn't need any introduction. But if you need some, he's been like a legendary figure in the world of game design for MMORPGs. He's worked on Ultima Online, he's worked on EverQuest 2, he's worked on Star Wars Galaxies. He's actually lead designed these games.
Yeah. That's true, I have. Yeah, I got started doing, I started doing game design when I was a kid. Started making board games that I could take to school and we could play during recess, right? But yeah, I started doing it professionally, mostly with MMOs, and my first game was Ultima Online.
But you worked on a MUD before that, which is why you got the job with Ultima Online.
That's right. I was working in text MUDs as a hobbyist. I started doing that kind of thing for fun around 93, maybe, 1993. And, some friends were getting into the industry. They recommended myself and my wife, actually, because all of us had worked together on Legend Mud, which was basically like the primordial ancestor, right, of MMOs. Back then, you played an MMORPG, but it was all text, like an old text adventure. And you did actually see other people in text, right, for those of your audience who've never seen a MUD. There's still thousands of them out there running, by the way. So we did Legend Mud, which was a world themed on history the way that people thought the world was at the time.
Kind of like a Renaissance era?
No, even more than that. If people thought that, for example, if you went to Victorian London, Sherlock Holmes was there, and so was vampires hiding in the churches. But if you went back to, let's say, you could go through the story of Beowulf. You could visit Roman Britain and hang out with Druids. If you went to the right time period, you could instead find Robin Hood. You could go over into Chinese mythology, or, we covered all different parts of the planet. We had South America, we had Central America, we had places all over Europe. So, if you visited Paris at the right time, you could find the Phantom of the Opera. You could go to ancient Greece, you could visit ancient Egypt, and go into the 1001 Nights, right? So all of that kind of stuff was there, and you time traveled between the areas. So we did that as a text MUD, and I officially launched in 94. It was open in 93, but officially launched in 94. It's still running today, actually, at legendmud.org. And several of us who were involved with that MUD and the one before it ended up in the game industry, funny enough. I first met Richard Bartle on that MUD because he was invited to come to the lecture series. That we used to run a lecture series in the world where we bring in people from the game industry to talk to people. Damien Schubert, who's now known for having worked on Shadowbane, he's currently on SWTOR. I first met him on text MUDs, and he did a little work on Legend Mud, but he did more work on Worlds of Carnage. And let's see, there were, who else? Rick Delishman, of course, he was the main guy. Todd McKimmey ended up doing work on Ultima Online. So a whole bunch of us, and the original UO team was full of MUD players. From Ambermush and Star Wars MUD and a bunch of other different MUD code bases. So when MMOs got started, that's where people found their designers, was going and looking at the text MUDs.
So all you designers who have had this influential impact on MMORPGs and the way that they've been designed, you all basically sort of just came from these MUDs, kind of like the MUD pack.
A lot of them, yeah, a lot of us. Not all of us, but quite a lot of us. So, for example, lots of folks are currently digging Spiral Knights or played Puzzle Pirates, for example. Daniel James, text MUD guy. He worked on one called Avalon. Yeah, there's an awful lot of people who came over and first started out on the Ultima Onlines, even the Lineage and Dark Ages side of things over in Korea, also inspired by text MUDs. Pretty much the whole MMORPG industry was inspired by text MUDs. There had been online games before on the kind of closed services like AOL, CompuServe, Prodigy, Genie, and in fact, at GDC Online this year, they gave the Hall of Fame award to the guys from Kesmai who had been making online games for those commercial services with Air Warrior and the like. But yeah, a huge amount of the MMORPG wave was actually people who came from text mods. We all used to hang out actually on one mailing list called MudDev. And the MudDev mailing list, the archives are actually out there on the net. They got boing-boinged when the archives were found because it was believed they were lost.
Nothing's ever lost on the internet.
Yeah, well, in this case, they were archived on one hard drive, and the machine suffered a catastrophic failure. So hard drive was like destroyed. So it was believed they were lost. People actually pieced the archives together from their email inboxes and reassembled it. Yeah, in order to preserve that stuff. And all of the movers and shakers in MMORPGs in the mid to late 90s were all on that mailing list. Trading ideas, trading knowledge. People from EverQuest, UO, the Korean games, Meridian 59, Dark Age of Camelot, all of these games. Everybody was hanging out on that list.
It's really interesting because I've seen when you look at the history, there's like the stuff that went on like in Britain and in America and South Korea, and it's like it would seem to someone who doesn't understand history that these all developed independently, but actually there was this mailing list and everybody mostly communicated with each other. And
well, I think you got to remember MUDs got started much earlier certainly than the MudDev mailing list. MUDs got going, if you date back to MUD 1, right, we're talking 1978. And they didn't really do a big explosion until the internet infrastructure was there enough, right, in terms of them getting outside of the UK even, right? So there were a bunch of early tries at different things, and Bartle is totally the guy who could tell you more about this, but there was Monster, there was Islands of Kesmai, that was done in the US by Taylor and Flynn, those are the guys who just got that award. Monster was done by Rich Skrenta, there was Mud, there was Habitat, which was the first graphical game that was done by LucasArts, Randy Farmer, Chip Morningstar. All of these got going in 70s to 80s, but until the network infrastructure was there in the late 80s, early 90s, it didn't really start spreading around a lot. And that's the period when MUDs in particular really exploded and went from being basically one chief kind of code base or people reinventing the wheel and started spreading out, and we got the user-generated content worlds and the chat worlds and the role-play worlds and the combat worlds, and today everybody talks about how Deku is the way that defines the gameplay style. Deku was a kind of MUD that got going in the early 90s. So even then, Usenet was the way that people stayed in touch, but a lot of this stuff was pretty scattered around. But the explosion of it on the internet meant that people in Asia started playing them. More of them started getting started in the US. So for example, Lambda Move, very famous as a place where a lot of the social challenges of virtual worlds got worked out to some degree. There was a book written about it called My Tiny Life by Julian DeBell. Dekus came out of Denmark, and Islands of Kesmai had come along. That originated to some degree with the stuff at Plato, I guess, with the Plato network. But the 90s is when it all exploded, and then people started getting in touch with one another. And I think that the moment in 95 is when basically graphics became possible, therefore everybody started doing graphics. And it was like, I think if we found the start date for Dark Ages, Lineage, Kingdom of the Winds, and Korea, Meridian 59, EverQuest, Ultima Online, Asheron's Call, I think we'd find that all of those probably got started within a couple of months of one another. They just all finished at different times.
Yeah, I know that Baron Kingdom of the Winds was localized as here in the States.
Yeah.
It started like about the same time Ultima Online did.
Yeah, so, I think, and back then we weren't yet in touch with one another. I didn't become aware of the Korean games until Lineage went into alpha, which I think UO was already in at least testing, if not out at that point. I remember visiting E3 while UO was in alpha and finding EverQuest hidden away, and Asheron's Call actually was out on the floor, right? So it was like suddenly it went from 0 to a whole bunch of stuff, and I think it's just because the time was right,
So you've been in this for so long. When do you think that people really started to look at the designing of these games as something they could create an actual science, an actual theory, and improve upon it? Because I imagine from the early days, you guys were just trying to make something that was fun, and you weren't thinking too critically about it, or I could be mistaken.
Well, one of the things about that MudDev mailing list is that it was a pretty, I don't want to say too academic, but I mean, it was a pretty thoughtful mailing list. It's hard to separate this from game design as a discipline versus the virtual world design discipline. The game design discipline really, it's only like the last 10 years that it's really started to come together in a big way. In the 90s, you had little ad hoc rules, you had stuff that had been talked about. I remember when the MDA, Mechanics, Dynamics, Aesthetics paper first came out, right? Or when there was the 400 project where Noah Falstein was gathering out the rules. There was design patterns that somebody like Doug Church was talking about. But of course there was Chris Crawford's work, and he was probably way ahead of everybody else, like way, way ahead of everybody else. He'd already gotten to the point of defining interactivity and, as a cyclic conversation between two actors and all this stuff. He started working that stuff out in the 90s. Somewhere I still have a manuscript copy on interactivity, actually, in which he has that definition. And that was 98, 99 that I got that. But I think a lot of stuff didn't start really crystallizing for game design as a whole until later, 2003 or something. But I think virtual world design, there was a fair amount of stuff that got put together even on the mailing list, right? I mean, the reason why the laws of online world design are out there is because so much great stuff was flying by on the list that I wrote to the moderator and said, it would be great if we captured some of these as one-liners so that we don't have to keep making the same mistakes. And he said, have at it. And I get credit for writing those, but I didn't. I gathered most of them rather than writing them. And that's why they're all named after people, right? Hadara's laws, Dr. Katz's theorem, blah, blah, blah. So there was a lot of thought going into what makes a virtual world work, an online world work, on that mailing list. And, MUDs had a lot of people who were academics playing them, because for the longest time you could only get to them if you were at a university. So naturally, right, it led to there being a lot of folks like that. And I think that's part of why the list and a lot of the discussions tended that way. We're talking people would write these giant long mails. They were huge, detailed essays. It wasn't just like a little forum chat. It was really in depth. Now I think a lot of stuff has been codified a lot more. I'm trying to remember the date for Hearts, Clubs, Diamonds, Spades, but I want to say it was, fairly early. Like, I want to say Bartle wrote that in the early to mid-90s. So, yeah, it's been going for a while.
So when you guys were creating Ultima Online, it was kind of like the Wild West in terms of where game design was. There were so many different things you guys tried to put in, like the ecology, that just didn't work for whether it just doesn't work in a virtual environment, or it just doesn't work for the culture of the gamers that were playing Ultima Online at the time.
Yeah, I think one of the things about the stuff that we were doing at Ultima Online, we had essentially tried to do a bunch of things that we were talking about doing for our next MUD. Really, that's where a lot of those ideas had come from. So the ecology stuff was actually something that my wife and I sent in as our design sample to Origin when we were trying to get the job. So we walk in the door and we get told, yeah, we're doing this cool ecology. And we're like, what? It was a little shocking. I think for us, the big thing on UO, right? We had one guy from Mushes, a couple of guys from LP Muds, a few guys from Deku Muds, and we really tried to marry those different philosophies, right? So I guess I should explain that because you probably don't have an audience that knows the differences. Deku Muds were essentially hack and slash level-based kinds of games. Mushes were tended to be role-playing and chat environments. Moos were like Mushes, but they tended to be about user-generated content and creating and building stuff. And LP Muds, LP was a code base that allowed you, it had the technical capability to do all the stuff that Moos and Mushes did, which Deku did not. But people tended to build Deku-ish stuff with it, rather than making Mush and Moo-like stuff. So all of these things went into the stew of how we ended up architecting and deciding how to set things up. But the hard thing, though, was that we were used to working with populations that were on the scale of what today would just make for a guild, not a whole game, right? So the fact that we were working with thousands of people simultaneously meant all kinds of different behavior patterns didn't work the way we expected them to. So for example, I was deeply opposed to a PK switch, essentially what is the norm, which is you can't player kill someone else unless both of you have turned on a little flag, right? And actually, you never see the old school PK switch system anymore. Nobody does it that way. But in UO, you could attack somebody and kill them anytime. On a MUD, we had two big problems with PK switches. Well, two phenomena with them. One was, because of peer pressure, you often wouldn't do PK, just because, indiscriminately killing everybody, if there's only 100 people around, you'll get ostracized and you don't have to leave the game.
Hard to make friends if you're...
Hard to make friends if you're a mass murderer, exactly. Because really, there were very few strangers. It just wasn't that large a player base. Flip side was, you could also always find, it's like squabbling in a family, right? You could always find a way to get around the PK switch. You could always find a way to have something fall on their head or train a monster near them or something. And because there's only 100 people, they know perfectly well that you did that to them, which means that then they call the cops, meaning they call the admins, the immortals, the gods, whatever they were at the time. And
so basically they pester you to ban them.
And they pester you to ban this person. You ended up spending, literally, I'm not joking, hours a day mediating squabbles between people. It was like being a parent of a bunch of kindergartners who all fight, right?
Yeah.
And so, went into UO going, PK switch, awful, right? And there's basically two choices. You could say no PK, or you could say, well, all PK. And it's up to you to solve the problem. You guys deal with it. For a whole bunch of reasons, player versus player combat adds enormous potential depth, right? So we ended up leaning on the side of open PK and trying to add in systems to keep it from going crazy. But because the game was so big, the peer pressure factor wasn't there. With 3,000 players simultaneously on a server and tens of thousands of characters, it was easy for somebody to be a mass murderer and get away with it. So all kinds of horrible misbehavior sprang up in UO, like immediately, that we were just completely unprepared for. Nothing like that had ever happened on the text months to that degree. I mean, we knew people would be bad, but in UO, the level of inventiveness was just insane. More than that, you could rely in the text mods on, if you gave someone a stern talking to, told them don't do that again, generally that would be enough. Not in this kind of scenario. You couldn't do that. You couldn't even keep track of all of the people easily, right? So stern talking tos didn't work, so you needed more hard-coded rules, or you needed tons and tons and tons of GMs constantly, pestering or watching over people. On top of that, because we'd made the simulation more robust, and it was way more robust than quite a lot of mods. Not as robust, ironically, as Mud 2. Mud 2 water flowed correctly, right? But, most decos didn't even really have physics, for example. So we had things like, hey, you can stack one thing on top of another, and things like that. And that led to people just coming up with all kinds of crazy things. So the fact that we allowed people, for example, to make furniture seemed fairly innocuous until some people actually laid siege to a city and barricaded it was a walled city, it was the city of Trinsic. They barricaded the main gates, which were the big open gates, with like thousands of armoires and wardrobes and dressers and chairs and tables so that people couldn't get out that way. And the only other exit was this narrow little area called Trader's Gate, which came through only one at a time or whatever. And so they barricaded the front and then waited for people to come out and whack them on the head when they come out the little narrow entrance, right? So,
and built like houses on top of the spawn points.
So spawns would happen inside their house. All of these things started happening because the systems were both richer and, games before that didn't let me build houses, right? So early on, we really tried fixing these things by saying, oh, it's because we didn't push the sim far enough, right? So that siege, what we did was it kept going, and finally the way in which it was broken was by us releasing the ability for you to chop up furniture and set it on fire. And that way they were able to bust out, and everybody loved it. It was a ton of fun. But after a while, keeping up with the simulation, it ended up being hard, and teams, not just the UO team, but all teams, started doing things like saying, we could have just skipped this problem if we just don't allow you to drop anything. And that's the way the games are now. You can't drop anything on the ground because, who knows, you might barricade somebody with it, right? So that rich, interactive, real simulation there has kind of fallen away. People don't do that anymore because the less rules and the more constrained the behavior, the more predictably they can police the space, right? And that's kind of what's happened, and that makes me sad because there's so much amazing gameplay that came from the inventiveness and the stuff that players could do. Right?
You would prefer the designers find solutions for these problems rather than ignore the problems altogether and just not do them or not try to do them.
That's right. I personally would, because I think one of the thing that many mods were aiming towards, right? Many mods and then UO and so on were aiming towards was a virtual world that felt realer and more alive and more like a real place. The kind of holodeck, singularity, whatever kind of thing, right? That's where that whole current was flowing. It was moving in that direction. I think if you look around the landscape today, there was Tale in the Desert, there was Eve, there was Galaxies, there's Second Life, and a few others, but that whole current has just kind of dwindled away, Instead of trying to build these alternate places, these true virtual worlds that are alternate places you can visit, instead we're using virtual worldness just as a feature in a really boring 1978 level of hack and slash CRPG, because CRPGs really, the gameplay in them hasn't changed since Wizardry much, right? They're mostly the same. So to me, that's way less interesting than everything that could be done with visiting an alternate universe, right? Instead, we're visiting an alternate universe in order to get a few XP, pick up some gold, and complete yet another quest.
So rather than just have like the latest DQ Mud clone, like EverQuest, World of Warcraft, games like that, you'd rather have something more like Dog Hacks, little world where the AI is so intelligent it's figured out a way to kill the players for real.
Well, I don't know about going that far. But
just the idea like that there's a real world there.
Yeah, a world that's unpredictable, right? Because I think that certainly this is my beef as a player, is that the world's pretty predictable. I don't need to play through to level even 10 on an MMO. I can pretty much get it from level 2 or 3 and kind of get, it's probably all there is this multiplied out, right? So the games they haven't really changed very much in that sense. They're still following that pretty basic, hack/loot level kind of thing. And as a designer, I don't find that very interesting. And as a player, I got bored of playing that game a while back, right? I first started playing that game 20 years ago, more now, right? If you count it isn't even what D&D was like. That was never the part of D&D I liked. I started playing D&D on the Redbox basic set, right? And that wasn't the fun part. It wasn't the leveling and the numbers juggling. It was the role playing and the adventure and the storytelling and
the stories you guys could create yourselves.
That's right.
Collaborate.
Yeah, and stepping into an alternate universe.
So at JDC Online, you did a wonderful presentation that, if you haven't seen it, you should definitely go to the JDC Vault and watch it. But in this presentation, you mentioned that you felt that the future for indies was very, didn't look so great, and that this was going to cause problem because big companies are a little bit more focused on games that are going to produce lots of money and not cause lots of problems, and less willingness to experiment with the types of worlds. Why do you think that it's going to be harder for the indies? Is there like a reason? Because I don't think you specified a reason in there. You just made a statement.
Well, the statement was based on business math, frankly. So first, let me start by saying I love indies, and I hope that I'm wrong. But the thing that worries me is, in general, we always see costs go up, right? So costs go up for making the games. And every once in a while they get reset because some new technology comes along that makes it way easier, right? So it used to be really cheap to make games on 8-bit computers, and then graphics started getting better and better, and then it got reset, right? And pretty soon people started getting closed out of making the games because you had to be too high-end to do it. And then it gets reset, and then PC gaming comes along, and all of a sudden the graphics are crappy again. It's the first PC games that awful graphics. They didn't have anywhere near the capability really of like Apple II, Atari, Commodore 64, right? So we always see this pattern, right? And games in the 90s and the first decade of the 2000s, even the indie games, it's like, well, if you don't have shaders and 3D models and blah blah blah, then you're not going to be very well suited, I guess, in a good position to really break out and make tons of money. And that got reset by Flash, right? Flash allowed that to be reset pretty dramatically, to the degree that PC gaming, most indie PC gaming, copied the art style of Flash games, right? When you look at most of the indies that came out in the last 10 years, the whole indie look is based on the look of Flash games. And of course, funny enough, a lot of the Flash games were imitating, they were doing a retro look to imitate the days of the 8-bits, right? So there's this thing where people, the indie creators, are always reaching towards simpler. And the reason they're reaching towards simpler is because it's so freaking expensive to do the high-end visuals and content-driven games. Making a zillion levels of something is just expensive and hard. And if you're an indie and you have a very limited budget, you can't take the time or spend your money in order to do that, it's very difficult to be profitable if your game has a high development cost. And that means you tend to be more conservative, right?
And reusability.
Right. And so what larger companies do, they can afford to make the glitz, right? They can make the glitz, but then they also have to be more conservative because they're playing with serious bucks, right? So they have to watch out and not do anything too crazy unless they're pretty sure they can earn back their dime, because they're all working for profit, right? So you've got this kind of pendulum swing that keeps going. And my comment was that right now I think we're entering a period where the costs for what the indie games guys have been doing are about to go up again. So, on Facebook, 3 years ago, you could make a game that was all text, and that was fine. Today, it has to be gorgeous isometric graphics that come from 3D rendered models. And in a year, you will have to be actually doing 3D graphics, because Flash 11 is out and it supports 3D graphics, and pretty soon, to be competitive, people will be pushed in that direction. Console games have gotten incredibly expensive to make. A console game of this generation costs more, for a mid-level console game, costs more to make than Galaxies did to make, right? So, you know, never mind how much an MMO costs. An MMO today costs literally 10 times more than what Galaxies cost. And Galaxies was already a multiple over what Ultima Online cost, right? So that curve is just skyrocketing. So that closes out people. It means a lot of people can't make the games. And the thing I'm seeing is we're having that happen to the places where indie gamers have been putting their games. So Facebook is having this happen, iOS is having this happen, and now with Flash 11, even Flash portals are going to start to have this happen. And that, to me, is a red flag for indie games. Unless something else comes along to reset the cycle, it makes me worry that they're not going to be able to afford to make the games. And if they can't afford it, we'll still have some, right? And sometimes somebody will get lucky. But, you know, as a thriving business segment, it feels like a very dangerous time for indies, to me, or for small shops in general. Last time we had something like this was in the late 90s, and we went from having like 20 or 30 games publishers down to 8. Because even a bunch of the big guys couldn't manage to make the switch.
So, your presentation that you did at JDC is pretty much like how you see things going wrong, where the indies cannot compete, and everything's the big corporations who possibly misuse the gamification metrics and how it's incorporated. How do you...
Sort of. I mean, to me, the whole gamification stuff, you know, it isn't even about big corporations. Big corporations are awesome. I work for one. They can do different kinds of things with games that indies can't, right? So, you know, there are things that can only be done with a giant budget. So it isn't really about that.
It's rather than, how about people who are just greedy and just trying to get something out there that's going to generate much money and not really caring how it's going to have a social impact.
Yeah, you're talking about the gamification part in particular, right there. Yeah, I think so my point about gamification was more that game thinking, I call it gamist thinking, right? Gamist thinking has been infiltrating everything over time, right? We're now seeing generations in the workforce who grew up completely with video games. Now, I believe, and anybody who's read my book knows this, I believe that games teach you things, that is what they're for, that is how they work, that the fun comes from the learning. And I also believe that games, by their nature, tend to teach things in particular ways, right? So games are essentially a place where you can go to practice something against a system, against this black box machine. And what you're trying to do is figure out the rules of how the system works. But right off the bat, that means that you go in with an assumption that there are rules and that there is a system and that it is possible for you to figure it out, right?
To win.
To win. And so that's like implicit in how games work. And that isn't an assumption, I think, that culturally we necessarily would have had 100 years ago. I think, you know, if you go back far enough, you'll find a common cultural assumption that there are no rules because the gods are capricious, and right, you know, and that there is no way to win, and that, you know, we're all doomed to die, and you know, you get the idea, right? But you know, different cultural assumptions come from the stuff that's around us. So by games telling us, no, everything is a system, everything can be solved, there are rules to it. If you just keep trying, you will figure it out. It's no big deal to die a bunch in the middle. You know, all of these things, they shape the way we tackle problems and they shape the way we think, right? And so, and you can assign points values to anything, and you you can measure everything and so on.
Even like Weight Watchers.
Right, and so, it's not like we haven't always been assigning points to things, right? People do that. That's normal. We've been doing that for thousands of years. But I think what's different is now having, a whole generation of people who's come up trained to problem solve that way. And the natural result of that is applying game methods to everything, right? So if you talk with like hiring managers, they'll tell you that millennials, right, Generation Y or whatever you want to call them, that they behave differently in the workforce because, I think, in part because they grew up playing games. But a lot of the things that they say millennials do, right? They work in teams all the time, which is great. That's awesome. But they also expect there to be a right answer to something, which isn't necessarily awesome.
Yeah, because it stifles creativity.
Right. They need to be told, when they have done a good job. This was a good job, So they kind of need the shower of stars to come out, right? Right.
More to come out.
Right. Yeah. They need the level update and whatever, because they've been trained to expect it, and the real world often doesn't give you such a thing, right? So there's a whole bunch of things like that I think games train you to expect, right? And I don't think that's a judgment, right? It's not a judgment for me. It's just an observation that the way people think is changed. It's different in the same way that people used to think differently before the printing press because they had to memorize everything, right? So, there were whole cultural practices around memory that we don't do today because it's easy. Well, we have books. And now, same thing. You talk with a younger kid and ask them to learn something, their response is Google. Why should I remember anything? Right? So I think for me, gamification is part of that overall trend. I think there are risks, right? There's dangers in that I think it's dangerous for us to assume everything has a right answer. It's dangerous for us to assume that everything be quantified, right? So I use the example a lot of the game The Sims, which is supposed to simulate people, human life, right? And it gets reduced down to 8 bars, one of which is needing to pee, right? Which is an oversimplification of the human condition, right? But it's the scary thing is it's a viable simplification of the human condition, and so it's like, oh, we can run with it, why not? And I think the worry is that you could do that, right, for all kinds of things and oversimplify things that shouldn't be oversimplified. When we build a model, it's easy to leave rules out and say, that's not really relevant, so we'll just skip it, right? To pick on Will Wright some more, a lot of people said SimCity. The original SimCity had embedded politics in it because pollution was, treated as this absolute negative, and mass transit rail systems were always a win, right? And so there was, there is an implicit message there in the model. And I think that's the thing about gamification that worries me, is that there's implicit messages in the model. And I'm not sure that we're thinking carefully enough about what those models are and what they're saying to us. Flip side is serious games, which, gamification has stolen its thunder. But to me, the strength of serious games is that they take incredibly complicated problems and say, look, we can solve this because it gets reduced down to the simple model. Once it's only these rules, look how easy it is, right? And so I think the sword cuts both ways. There's the danger of oversimplifying, but there's also the benefit of being able to look at intractable things and realize maybe we can reduce this down, maybe we can solve this problem, instead of just giving up. So it cuts both ways for me.
So that's like the negative side. What's the positive side of serious games? So the ways that you can use gamification to cause a positive social change in the world.
Well, I think there's a bunch of different potential positives, right? The easiest to think about is incentive structures. And there's been a lot written and talked about with incentive structures. And it's the place where gamification goes to first, and in my mind often ignores the real value, right? We all know that if you dangle the right kind of carrots, the right points, whatever, you can get people to start doing something. And that by itself is incredibly powerful. It's just also very easy to misuse it or use it shallowly, right? But it's still a very powerful tool in the arsenal. Where it gets married with something really good, to my mind, is when they start leverage the real strength of games, which is that games are learning tools and training tools and practice tools. That's a place where you can really start to get something that's really good. And we've seen a lot of things these days that are oriented, for example, around education or around health, that marry the just simple points and incentives stuff to something that's more substantial. And probably the simplest is the quantified self thing, which just marries, it's basically marrying points measuring to your physical activity, for example. Measuring how many minutes you spend doing something, or whether you're jogging or running, and calorie counts and all of that kind of thing. And just being able to show you the track record of it serves as a reason to change your behavior, right? Going further, though, I think the real potential for serious games for change, comes when they are making use of the fact that games build systems and models, right? And having building models of complex situations so that people can actually practice with them and try and run samples and do iterative runs and play them like a game in order to come to a better understanding of something that is complex, right? And to me, that's the real value of something with serious games, is that they take these things that are very difficult and can find ways to let people play with them until they realize how they work. Because from there, then people can make their own choices about how to change themselves or change the system as it works in the real world, because they've come to a systemic level understanding of things, right? To me, that's very different from us dictating just by saying, we're going to give you points for this, but not for that, which doesn't leave a lot of scope for change. It's very easy for somebody to be manipulated by what points you choose to grant them, right? So yeah, for me, that's where a lot of the potential lies, is in that systemic thinking.
In your book, you said, as you said earlier, games are ultimately about learning, about ways to teach people in very efficient ways. Where do you see educational games going in the future? Do you see it like something that becomes very much a part of like the public education system, for example, to really,
I think it's going to be very hard to get them all the way into the educational system. There's a ton of interest from teachers, not so much from administrators, but lots from teachers. I think the thing about games in education, the first thing is realizing that games teach, period, right? And educational games, edutainment, has a long history of, call it the flashcard game, right? Which just kind of sucks, where they try to use the simple point systems or something to show you math flashcards, right? Congratulations, you scored 80 out of 100 in adding together numbers. And that misuses the core strength of games, right? Games are great at the systemic thinking. They can help you learn to memorize and whatnot, but you learn how to memorize or learn how to operate the levers in service of better understanding of the system. And so, for example, in an RPG, you might be very willing to do tons of math to calculate exactly how much gold you can carry and where you want to allocate your points and all of that sort of thing. But you're not doing it because the game is allocating points. You're doing it because the game is something else, and this is a tool to help you master the larger system. That's the difference between the flashcards and good educational game design. As long as you can't just say, here's some chocolate, here's some broccoli, I'll give you more chocolate if you eat the broccoli. That chocolate-covered broccoli doesn't really work. Instead, what you want to say is, to give a terrible metaphor here, hey, here's this problem to solve, which will get you, that problem is the chocolate. Among the tools available to you is broccoli, ice cream, da 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 da. And when people figure out, wait, broccoli is a good tactic here, they will master broccoli in order to get what they want. That's a very different approach, right? When you just throw the problems in front of people and say, you gotta get this done, it stops being about the game. It starts being about the drilling, and that's no longer fun, and that's why it tends to fail. That's why kids spot that a mile away, right? When you're talking about the kids, and even at older ages, we push ourselves through it only because we have to. It isn't really where the advantage comes. Instead, more kids probably can learn basic economics from running in a lemonade stand, right? So, you know, there's a reason why Lemonade Stand was one of the first games ever made. It was Lemonade Stand, and sure enough, an awful lot of people learned about profit and loss and all the rest from trying to run a lemonade stand because it was fun. The game wasn't about teaching them profit and loss, though.
What was the conclusion? So, Playdom, what you're doing now. What is Playdom about specifically? Because there's a lot of our audience that don't play social games.
Right.
And what does Playdom do?
Well, Playdom is the social games unit of Disney Interactive. So basically that means social games. A lot of people think that means games that are about social connections. It actually means games that are played on social networks. So social networking games, they haven't been around for very long because social networks haven't been around for very long. And these are the ones like Farmville, Sorority Life, Momsters, all of those kinds of things, where you play on Facebook or on other social networks. You know, the social element comes in that not only they're on social networks, but people, because you can see your friends, right? You see your friends circle. If other friends are playing the game, you can send stuff to one another. So basically you're playing single player games for the most part, but you're playing them alongside one another with the ability to help each other as you go. So Playdom is Disney's unit that makes that kind of game, basically. You know, it's a very rapidly growing segment, and in some ways, for me, the reason I'm interested in it is because social games are giving us the largest multiplayer canvas that has ever existed on Earth. You know, previous to this, the largest canvas we had tended to be maybe the PHP web strategy games, like Trajan or Ebony, and before that, the MMOs. Never before have we been able to make a game, a million-player game, right? Never in history, and that's really what social games offer us the ability to do, is make a million-player game. So that's why I'm interested in them, because I came from the MMO side. After doing the MMOs, after Galaxies and the stuff at Sony Online, I did MetaPlace, which was a web-based virtual world thing, and we made a go of that and didn't succeed, so we ended up switching to making social games, and Playdom acquired us. So that's what Playdom is, and that's what those games are. They get a lot of flack from core gamers, from game hobbyists, because they're, compared to core games, very simple. Their audience is primarily non-gamers, people who don't think of themselves as gamers. A lot of women, you know, age 35 or 40, people who have not been playing video games, which means you have to start from a different place, right? You have to assume they don't know about all of the intricacies of Call of Duty, and they don't care, right? It's both not in their demographic interests, it's not the kinds of things that they like, but it's also just bafflingly complicated, right? Compared to the level of game that they are looking for. So the cool thing about that is that you get to reinvent a bunch of stuff from starting premises, right? It's also a very new kind of segment, and that means it's kind of wrapping up the boom period. And during the boom period, there was a lot of anything goes kind of mentality. And I think now we're coming out of that and into a period where the games have to be real games and entertaining and hold people on their own merits without using any of the kind of boomtown tactics of spamming friends and all that kind of thing. So I think they're about to become a very creative, vibrant kind of area.
So is this period kind of like it was with Ultima Online, sort of like the Wild West social games?
It's a little past the complete way. The Ultima Online period was last year, and at this point we're already past the EverQuest period. I would say we're heading into the further later periods. To me, the industry feels a lot like '98, maybe. Especially, but I think we're about to start seeing huge budgets. We're about to start seeing lots more harder core games. We're about to start seeing, fancier graphics because of Flash 11, all of that kind of thing.
Do you see social games sort of like merging with MMORPGs?
Or displacing them. I think the big thing about MMOs is who has the time, I think is the big question. And, further, if you ask somebody like Richard Bartle, he'll tell you that why do people play MMOs or mods or virtual worlds? And his answer will be they play it for exploration of their self-identity. They do it as a way to find out who they are. Well, MMOs right now are still booming in the kids segment, but not so much in any older demographics. And if Bartle is right, that makes perfect sense. Because who has the most free time and is most in need of defining who they are? It'll be younger people. For a long time we had observed that MMOs and mods, people tended to play them for about 2.5 years and then drop out of the hobby. So if we're hitting those 2 years now at age 11 or 12, we're not going to have a lot of older MMO players. It'll be the minority who end up doing it as a hobby. So I think in a lot of ways, the social canvas that is hot is the social networks, rather than saying you have to spend 2 hours a night or more, right? That time investment is just incredibly heavy, right? So people who are older have less time, but still want to do something fun with their friends. It just has to be something that doesn't take as much planning and as much hours sitting still. The whole let's get together a group taking 2 hours followed by a quest taking 4. If you're an older person, you don't have 6 hours in an evening to do that kind of thing. So shorter session games like social networks provide, like mobile games provide. I don't think it's an accident mobile games and social games look an awful lot alike. A lot of social games are on mobile these days. Those things just fit people's lifestyle better, even though they're simpler, and core gamers say, but that's not a real game. It's a game you can play in the time that you have with your friends, right? So it's better than no game at all, for sure. And may very well offer new kinds of gameplay that just hasn't been seen before.
Well, this has been a very stimulating conversation that we've had. I hope that our viewers have fully enjoyed it as much as I have. Thank you so much, Mr. Koster, for your time.
Sure thing. Happy to do it.